The Hawk Enigma is a book I wrote based on some of the work I used to do for Naval Special Warfare Command, which is the headquarters of the U.S. SEAL teams. Outside of the application of some of the technology, about 95% of what I wrote in there is real.
Jim, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I have your book with me here. We're going to be talking about it today, The Hawk Enigma. Thank you so much for sending me a copy.
Yeah. Thank you for taking it.
Let's get right into the pitch.
Yeah, so The Hawk Enigma is a book I wrote based on some of the work I used to do for Naval Special Warfare Command, which is the headquarters of the U.S. SEAL teams. And the main character works on something called the Directorate, which is an advanced research and development group. He also suffers from kind of a traumatic past, and he's been having these reoccurring dreams and starting to hear some prophetic voices, and he believes that he's actually losing his mind. At the same time, across the ocean in Japan, two scientists working on something called the God algorithm have disappeared, and he's about to find that the disappearance of these scientists, the form of artificial intelligence they've been working on, and potentially his past may have something to do with each other.
Nice. So where did it all begin? Where did this idea originate from?
So the concept of the Hawk Enigma actually started at a symposium at Caltech. I was with a friend of mine who was giving a lecture on aspects of artificial intelligence for the military back in 2019. And one of the professors at Caltech, her name was Viviana Gradinaro, stepped up and started talking about something called optogenetics, where they were using machine learning algorithms to identify specific proteins to treat people with diseases like Parkinson's or vision loss. And the thing that's crazy about this particular type of technology is it uses light to manipulate synaptic activity in the brain after injecting proteins into the fat and the lipids inside of your brain cells. And so the concept was completely crazy, and it's almost like the plot sort of hit me. Been thinking about writing for a while, and some plots were not really there, and I just didn't know what I wanted to write about. And then I went to that symposium, and it was almost like, and I this almost sounds cliche, but the plot almost quite literally just popped in my head and was like, this is the kind of story that you should dig into. And then I started writing, and about 6 months later, I'd finished my first draft.
6 months. That's very cool. I didn't realize how much of what you wrote certainly sounds authentic because of how you write about it, but I didn't realize how close to reality it actually was. That's amazing.
Yeah, outside of the application of some of the technology, about 95% of what I wrote in there is real.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about some of the topics that I get into in the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you juggle so many things? You have the military, you have the rafting, you have the AI, you have there's so much going on.
Yeah, so it's inevitable that an author puts a lot of themselves into the story. And initially I just had this idea of braiding several stories together based on certain topics that I knew really well. However, it also became a vehicle for exploring the characters in a useful way. And so I just wrote what made sense to me. I had never written a book before when I wrote this. And so I wanted to create structure, and so I spent a whole bunch of time really focusing on story process and story structure and story character development, and digging into what needed to work with the story, and then eventually committing to a full editorial process of getting a editorial assessment done to basically make sure the plot's good, and the developmental edit and all those other things that you got to go through, and the painful process of putting something out there that makes you feel vulnerable and then allowing somebody to just completely rip it apart.
Yeah.
And humbling myself to being willing to accept that criticism, but at the same time it allowed for me to explore a whole bunch of topics that I understood well, but at the same time, it gave me an avenue for exploring the characters themselves in a way that I felt was extremely important. Not just important, but exciting at the same time.
Were there a lot of changes between your first draft and the editorial? And when you did the editorial, how did you find you almost must have needed an expert to even really comprehend a lot of the things that you were talking about in order to put it together for the end result.
In some respects, yes. In other respects, no. Because at the end of the day, you need to have the average reader able to understand the story. Yeah. And so if you make it complicated and they don't get it, you failed, right? If it's it was that balance between giving them the information they need to understand the plot and and read and what you're writing as authentic, at the same time balancing that against what moves the story along. And so there were moments where I was being too technical, and it actually wrote me into corners because I was so technical that I couldn't hand wave certain parts that needed to be hand waved for the purpose of speed. So the editing process really just came back to, does this make sense for this character, or less about, does this make sense technologically? And so that's where the editors really came in. And I chose editors that did not understand the genre, but enjoyed the genre, if that makes sense. I didn't need a technical expert. My editor isn't a technical expert, and she writes. A lot of the feedback she would get me is she would say things like, "You're too smart for your reader," not as an insult to the reader, but as an aspect of, you're being too technical. Just calm this down, focus on the plot, except at the same time give them these nuggets that make it exciting and realistic.
How did you balance that? I guess it was just in the editing process, because you could have told the story by being very vague. It's a techno thriller, which people expect a little bit more of the information on the technology side, and you know it, so that's great. But how did you decide to balance just plain action with going deeper into the technology? Because you could have, granted it would be a shorter book, but you could have kind of glossed over a lot of the explanation of the actual tech and how the proteins work and everything, and just told the story.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I could have cut out of the story, but there's a lot of things that I think that are critical for understanding not just the way that the scientists chose to do the things that they did in the story, but embedded within the technology itself is the motivation of the individuals, and you can't break the two apart. I wanted to try and tie in that when people are focused on technology like that, it is a part of their entire personality, in the way that it's not just that person likes computers, so they're the computer person. That it's way beyond that. The other thing is, even in the third chapter of the book, the main character describes something called a PFM box, and that was a PFM. I say pure frickin' magic in the book, but they use a different word in real life. But a PFM is a term that we would use to people when they didn't understand what the technology was inside of it. We just say, "Hey, it's a PFM box, and it does its thing." And that way you don't have to explain all the technical jargon to it. And so there's a point where my character has to do that with the SEALs he's working with, because they don't care about how the technical stuff works. They're like, "This finds the people." And you're like, "Yes, it finds the people." And they go, "How do they do that?" It's like, "It's PFM. It's called the PFM box." And they go, "Oh, okay, great. I got it." And they don't want to ask questions because they don't want to sound stupid. But at the same time, it's like, don't worry about it. At the same time, I had to do that for two reasons. I had to do it for one, I needed to obfuscate actual real world technological capabilities that are sensitive, while exploring the concept with the reader so it's still exciting. And so I used my experience with the SEALs to do that by hiding what I was actually doing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. You mentioned, are you a big reader? You mentioned it took you 6 months to write this book, and this was your first book, which is very impressive. Were you a big reader of the genre prior to writing the book?
I read some. I used to read a lot of Tom Clancy, and a lot of I read a bit of Jack Carr, but I read a lot of nonfiction. And to be honest, when I started writing, this is just what came out. Okay. I was just picturing like a movie. I was like, if I were to write this how a movie plays, what movie would I want to watch? And so I want when you're reading the book to feel like you're watching a movie, and I want it to be at the speed of a movie. And that was more or less what I focused on. But the technology and the operations, I just focused. I literally was like, how would I conduct this mission? How long would it take for me to get from point A to point B? What kinds of things would be going on? And I just planned it as if it was a real world situation. And driving off of the real world aspect of it, it just turned into a thriller, is more or less what happened. But if you ask about the reading that I do, I did read in the genre of horror, but I've also read a lot of other genres at the same time.
A lot of authors I interview have either had books that they would never show anyone, or this is, book number 5 or something. But for you to go book 1 off the bat and write a book this good is very impressive.
Well, thanks. It hurt. It was painful. Yeah. Almost as much as book 2. I think book 2 hurt more, but book 1 was... Book 2 hurt for different reasons. It hurt because it was like, it was like squeezing oil out of you're just the pressure and stuff to make it just was much significantly different than the first one. The first one was just exciting and fun,
Yeah.
but not knowing what you were doing was the part that was pressure. The pressure was on, you know.
Yeah. What's your support network like at home when you're trying to write this book? Do you have people that are reading it for you, or is it just people that are kind of like cheerleading to say you can do it? What's that like?
I have some close friends who are good beta readers of these for me. I'm careful about what beta reading sections, but I had people that were willing to be honest with me about what they liked or didn't like. I have a friend of mine who he probably crushes 2 thrillers a week easily, and so I was like turning to him like, does this fit? And in my first book, he said that it worked, but he's like, it was very much, it was different. It had its own voice in both good ways and in bad ways, because he was like, this doesn't fit the traditional thriller. There's a lot more character development than you would get, I think, in a lot more show and less tell that you would get in kind of like, not to knock on a Clancy novel, but Clancy is, you don't dig really deep into the characters in a Clancy novel. You get some depth, but you don't get a lot. A little bit more tell and show because it's focusing on the technology. You're more interested in what the aircraft are doing and what the ships are doing than you are. The characters are fun, but I was more digging into that. So I had friends my close friends would do that. I also had technical experts that from national laboratories and from industry that read a lot, and I would throw it back at them and I would say, is this working? And they would come back and say, you got this part wrong. This measurement was incorrect. However, at the same time, they would say they would look at it technically and be like, these two things don't make sense. You're adding in a dynamic here that wouldn't work. And as you're writing, you don't realize you're doing that. You're just writing what you think makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's when you step back and can see the forest for the trees that you go, oh, I see that misstep. And then that happened after my editorial assessment. I ended up dumping a lot of it and having to rewrite big sections, and I'm significantly happier with the way it played out because it was really bothering me the way that it was certain plot points that my buddy was referring to it as the magic blood, and the magic, there's an element of blood in the story that wasn't well tied off, and it was bothering me. And then several people had said it didn't work, and then suddenly it clicked, and I dumped several chapters, got rid of certain characters, and simplified it, and suddenly it made way more sense, and that whole problem and that narrative went away completely.
How painful was that?
Well, the hard part is when it's hardest. I mean, there's a very famous Stephen King saying, that you don't be afraid to kill your babies.
Yeah.
So that was hard when you've put a lot of effort into it, and it's a really good chapter, and then you just completely dump it. But it's become so common now. That at the time it was really hard because I wasn't used to doing that. I wasn't used to saying, I don't need this chapter, I'm going to get rid of it. And now I'm at the point where like in my current book, I wrote 30, 40 chapters, and I recently just dumped 20 of them because I was like, that's not going to work. It won't work, so I can't be emotionally attached to it and hold myself back by clinging to it for too long. It's okay to completely shift, because in the current book I'm writing, for example, I didn't like the place where it was taking place. I didn't like the setting. And because I had a bad emotional connection with that setting, I knew it would come out in the writing. Because I can't make a place I don't like seem magical or exciting to be in, or an interesting place as a whole, unless I'm being extremely negative about it. But then I don't want that to be the vibe of the story. So I had to completely change the setting and dump it all, because plot-wise it didn't make sense for any of the characters to be in this other location that I moved it. So I had to change everything. And that's, as a reader, that's just to mature. In the beginning, having to do that, it was tough. But after I had a professional editor come back and say, you got to get rid of these things. You could do what you want, but this part doesn't work. And they'd give me such great advice in the other parts of the book that it just made sense. So I ended up dumping them. And it worked out.
So do you plot or outline the book prior to writing it? Or do you just go with it as the ideas come, like you're saying, do you just write it like a movie in order to have to cut that many chapters?
The first book I outlined to an extent, but I had a very strong idea of how it would end already. I was like, this is the vision I have for the ending of the story. The second book started off with me trying to outline it, but it wasn't working. So it's like if you're asking me if I'm a pantser or a plotter, I don't know, whatever term you want to use.
Yeah.
I'm kind of in between the two, where I have to create some structure, but I don't know how it's going to get there, and I just kind of go as it goes along.
Yeah.
I have found that I also can't write quickly. If there's certain things that I probably should do that are better, and I'm okay with giving myself grace with being patient with it. If I want to enjoy the writing, because to be honest, most writers don't make money doing this. I don't. If you're doing it because you're trying to make a lot of money, then you're in the wrong industry. If you're doing it because you want to write a good story, give yourself the grace of taking your time.
Yeah. Yeah, I asked that because with the first draft, I always try and make the first draft as fun as possible and just write it and not worry too much about it. So if I've cut chapters, I cut chapters in revising. Did you end up cutting chapters? It sounds like you cut chapters because it wasn't working for you. So you were like quite a ways into the book and then just cut a whole chunk, almost like starting over.
Yeah, the only time it hurts is when I have it's the best way to put it, the flow of the story and the way that because I feel like there's a rhythm in a good chapter. Like you can physically feel a good rhythm as the story goes along. Not to say that it's falling into an iambic pentameter type, but at the same time, you can tell when it's off. The flow isn't right. It doesn't hit right. I can physically feel it. It's weird, but I physically can feel it when it's not correct, and I don't like it. Okay. And what's hard is when I read a chapter and that rhythm is just right, and then I've got to get rid of the chapter. And I'm like, can I take pieces of that and put it in a new chapter and have the same rhythm? I can't, but I've got to accept the fact that it's not going to be that way. Like I wrote another book that I ended up just dumping and I don't know, it might come back up later on, but it was an emotional reaction more or less to a time that was going a period of our history. And I felt that if I wrote it the way that it was right then, it would feel very trapped in that moment rather than kind of more of a timeless writing. But there's a couple chapters in there where I'm like, oh man, that is so good. And it'll never be read because and I just have to accept the fact that I was just proud of the fact that I even wrote it to begin with. And that was it. That's okay.
Yeah. So what research went into the Hawk Enigma, given your background and knowledge already?
So I had lived in Japan before, but I'd never been to Tokyo. So I had to do a lot of physical mapping of that environment without having been there. Okay. There's some technological research, but that was just something that it was just building off of something I already knew. I called some people to physically interview, to actually personally interview them to make sure that what I was doing was correct. Sometimes I'll reach out to people at national laboratories or other individuals that I've worked with professionally in the past to say, does this chapter make sense? Mm-hmm. But the biggest one was getting the setting correct in a way that made sense for my story. Recently, I was at BoucherCon in New Orleans, and I was on a panel, and the other panelists were adamant about not writing a story about a place you've never been to. And I said, well, my second book takes place on the Kazakhstan-China border. I'm not physically going to be able to go there. At the same time, I thought it was a very interesting story to write. So how do I write a story with authenticity about a place that I can't physically go to? And there's certain levels at which, because they were asking, they said, well, how much does it take you out of the story if you've been to that place and you know the author's getting it wrong? And I said, well, I said, by show of hands, who's seen or likes the show Breaking Bad? And pretty much everybody raised their hand, because it's a great show, right? I said, well, I grew up in Albuquerque, and they will set things in parts of the city that makes absolutely no sense. Like where they're doing some of these deals, I'm like, dude, I know exactly where that is, and that's the last place I would do a drug deal. Or that would happen literally on the corner of this street. And so I was like, does it take me out of the story? I just kind of chuckled to myself and let it go because the story's good. If the story's good, it doesn't matter. But I did have the chance to going back to the question about researching in Japan. I was able to go back to Japan for work a couple times this past year, and I was pleasantly surprised at how relatively accurate Google searches and YouTube video allow you to be when understanding those environments, because it was pretty accurate to what I thought it was going to be. So I was pleasantly surprised by that.
Yeah. When you created Voodoo and his team, were there any moments where you adjusted the story to be more authentic to the reality in your experience because you have that background of knowing. There must be a line where you think, okay, I need this to happen for the plot, even if it's not plausible in a real life
Yeah.
situation. Versus,
There were a
but
couple
still
situations where, yeah, there were a couple situations where I combined two locations slash exercises or whatever into one thing because I needed the story to go in that direction. Like there's a section where they're on a mountain in Utah, and then they found a private range to do shooting. That was me combining desert-based land warfare with cold weather training. You would never go into a shooting environment on a mountain like that. That wasn't real. However, for the plot, I had to combine the two.
Okay.
But individually, they both were completely true. It's just the environment changed. So when people read it, they're like, why the heck would they be doing that? And somebody who knows the community well will be like, that doesn't make sense. But there's a level of disbelief, suspense and disbelief because, one, I can't be exactly accurate to the community because I want to protect the community. At the same time, the plot has to move at a certain speed. I can't have you jumping from location to location to tell these little minuscule parts of a story when I can combine them into one fluid event.
Yeah.
So that has to happen.
Okay. And the white water rafting, was that something you have experienced before, or was that all research? Because that felt really real.
No,
as
that
you were
was
describing.
experience. It was
Okay.
I was a river guide. I lived in.
Oh, okay.
I didn't use the same names, but I used to live in an abandoned steakhouse called I forgot. I'm confusing it between them. It was called the. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of the real one. Anyway, we lived in an abandoned steakhouse next to a Days Inn. And it was literally just wooden overhead and a big steak pit. And three of us lived in tents in there. And I'd walk across the street to see if I was on the trip for that day, either running what was called the daily, or running Westwater, or running Cataract Canyon. And if I wasn't, I'd just grab my kayak and then I'd go boating and all day long until my friends got back, and then we go rock climbing. That was like my life for 4 months.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was great. Yeah, it was amazing. Went from that straight into boot camp, so it was just yeah, it was a huge shift.
Yeah, that would have been a huge shift for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the rafting part is definitely part of. Some people felt that I shouldn't have left it. I should have got rid of it. But I felt that it just I thought it combined a good backstory, and it tied in. I love it when stories feel like something is completely irrelevant and then it's critical to the plot.
Yeah.
But you're just watching it play out, knowing it's going to pay off eventually.
Yeah.
And I love that feeling when it finally pays off and you're like, oh, and then you realize there's other things about the way that it was playing out that you weren't picking up on, and then it was all right in front of your face. I love that feeling.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of shows do that nowadays, and especially when they play with time. And so I wanted to incorporate that in the story somehow, which also made it more complicated than maybe it needed to be. Lesson learned, but it was still fun to put it in there.
It felt really authentic, which is, I think, the difference between the fact that you had done it and experienced it before and the way he was doing it. And then I just trusted that it was going to pay off in the end, that it was all going to come back together. Had it not come all, full circle by the end, then it wouldn't have been as good because it's just like a plug, but it was, obviously it did. So it was fun to read. I liked it.
Good. Appreciate it.
The book covers, I love the book covers. And it's always interesting to think of when you have like military and you have AI, because I wrote a book sort of like that too, not techno so much, but how do you combine like the army with the tech to try and make it so that someone who's looking at it will sort of know the genre or try to know the genre, because it's a tricky one. Did you come up with it, or was that
so I had a different cover before that was done okay, and then I actually hired the guy that did Jack Carr's covers. And he and I collaborated and bounced some ideas, and then I got him some stock photos that I thought were interesting, and then we just eventually landed on this design. He did a lot of it, did a great job at it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but at the end of the day, like I wanted it to I wanted you to immediately know what you were getting yourself into when you look at the book. You're like, okay, but at the same time being careful about it feeling overly military, because that's something that also people are like, okay, I'm reading this because it's another Clancy novel, and then I'm delving into more post-traumatic stress. And my second book, I get really into the dynamics of the team and how the wrong or right person will it makes the mission what it is, and that may not be what people are expecting sometimes in that book, because it gets kind of heavy, and then at the same time it gets really goofy, because I like to balance humor with intensity, and it's not that I run around shooting all the time. Like there's like I almost like it when the shooting part isn't as intense as the internal struggles within the team. And I almost like there's a chapter in the Hawk Enigma after this major event in Tokyo, and they kind of feel like it's that all is lost kind of feeling in a moment. That chapter of them recognizing the weight of their problem, to me, was more fun to write than a lot of the action scenes. I loved dealing with that, because that's reality. That's more what you're facing a lot of the time.
Yeah. I like depth of character, and that's hard to find in this type of book, because a lot of it is that Tom Clancy action stuff where the plot is driving the story, not so much anything to do with the characters. So
yeah, you get like a chapter in the beginning. He's got a home life. Got it. Moving on. So and then
yeah, exactly.
I'm not trying to knock on that genre. It's like some people just want that. They just want, and so when they pick up my book and there's like more meat to it, it surprises them. Some people love that, and some people may not be their cup of tea. I have a hard time when I pick up a book and it's just a bunch of action, but the action doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And so I've read several books where like I DNF a lot of books just because I'm like, is this worth my time? And that's not because, and I never write a review saying I DNF this. I just think that's a jerk move. Like if you don't like a book, you don't like a book. It's fine. If you like a book, let everybody know. If you don't, then don't. But there's plenty of books that I've read where they jump right into the action without giving me any stakes. And then every time they have action, they're very similar. And I never wanted to go through an action sequence where I felt the stakes were even remotely the same, or the intensity was the same. There's different layers to it. So, and every single time you have a combat evolution, you have to learn something about your character, and recognizing that the action has to show something or lead to something. It makes the story significantly better. And anytime you've watched a movie where there's been action that does that, you find yourself connected to it in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's what I was going for.
You had something as simple as Stu Bear, which was hilarious, at the same time brought a lot of realism and likability to that character just by calling him Stu Bear. And that's not something you would really see necessarily in an action book like that, with just a nickname like that. But it was perfect because it brought him.
That's reality,
so
though.
Real, yeah.
Yeah, that's reality, though. I mean, you go into a team, they have stupid nicknames for each other, and they or somebody made something up and then it won't let go, and then it just. I mean, that's the same thing with any real call sign, because it's the same thing with pilots. Pilots don't name themselves. Somebody names them that because something happened.
Yeah. And
sometimes it's a cool name. Most of the time it's stupid, so they don't want to be completely insulting, but it's the same kind of thing. Like I wanted to not go crazy with the cool guy nicknames, but at the same time, just it's reality. So Stu Bear was a funny one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously Voodoo's the main character, so that he also had I like the backstory in that with how you also plugged all that in there and why he was Voodoo. And I won't talk about the reveal, of course. Don't want to spoil it yet. We'll talk about that after. Writing the villain, which was it? I don't know the pronunciation. I said Rue in my head, but I don't know if that's how he's essentially the main villain of this story, who we meet in that respect. Were you trying to write someone who we felt somewhat empathetic for, or almost like his own mission, trying to understand his mission and his goal within it?
Yeah. So without giving spoilers away of the background of, in Japanese, his name is pronounced Ryu. It's kind of like a Japanese R is like an L and an R kind of mix. So Ryu is how you pronounce it. But Ryu is what I wanted out of the villain wasn't just, once again, he can't be motivated. I like Dan Brown's perspective on this. Dan Brown in his masterclass talks about villains and how motivating them with greed is just kind of two-dimensional and empty, right? Mm-hmm. But also motivating it by just vengeance is another one that doesn't make sense because it's limited in what it is. So I wanted you to see him as he has facets to how he is taking advantage of situations, but there is motive behind every single one of them that you aren't expecting. Mm-hmm. And by default, you look at it and say, oh, he's just a bad dude who wants this particular thing. He's doing this for money. And then you look under it and he's like, oh, he's doing it for power. And you look under it and he's like, oh, he's doing this for something else. And then that point in time, you're never conflicted. You know who the bad guy is all the time. But there's a moment, I want you to have a moment where you empathize with him, where you're like, what if we told this story from his perspective? Would Voodoo be a villain?
Yeah.
You know, I want that to be a possibility, and not one that you would think of, because your perspective of the story immediately assumes the protagonist is the one that you're telling the story from. And I want you to question that. Now, it may not have succeeded and gone far enough, but at the same time, thinking that way helped me give better perspective. Also, if you go back to the original motivation of that character and where they're from and how they ended up there, a lot of things led to that, to what they think. I'm sorry, I'm being really vague about it.
Yeah, for the spoilers, yeah.
but where he's from really drives his motivation and his loyalties.
Yeah.
And then what happened because of that. And then you also realize what he was told versus reality versus all these other things have led him to this point where he himself may or may not be manipulated by the situation. And then there's this, that's tragic. And it's tragic he ended up where he was.
Yeah.
And what the decisions that he has to make. And so that's what I wanted out of that character. I didn't want him to just be like, just the villain.
Did you write him that way from the beginning, or did you flesh him out after?
Yes and no. In the very beginning, I actually had a hard time with him because I wanted him to be one thing and I knew he'd be something else. But articulating that is what took more time to really flesh out.
Yeah. A question from Wesley Smith, who was our last guest on the show. We have a pay it forward with the guest questions. He wants to know, what is your writing routine?
So I try to, when I'm in a good rhythm, I try to put down something every day. But I used to be real hard on myself. Like, if you're not putting down this many words every day, then you're wasting your time or beating myself up. I have too many goals in my life to beat myself up for not meeting those. Like, am I playing an instrument enough? Am I working out enough? Am I writing enough? Am I studying enough for my day job? Am I paying enough attention to my kids? Am I paying enough? So all those things are just going to rack on your head at all times. Yeah. So writing has to be a release for me. It can't be yet another box I need to check for the day. So I do one of two things. I give myself a realistic limit of what I'm trying to get out of the writing for that week. I try to sit down and commit myself to writing, not just when I'm inspired, but when I'm not inspired as well, and getting a routine of writing something. But what I've noticed with a lot of my books is inspiration strikes in places that I'm not expecting. So I'm always open to that strike of inspiration. And so I use Scrivener on my phone, which syncs with my computer through Dropbox. And so if I'm talking to someone, watching something, reading something, anytime I get inspiration, I open Scrivener, I write down my thoughts immediately right then and there. Okay. And then when it's time for me to write, I go back to that notes section and I say, okay, what were the things that were going from there? And I have like thousands of different things that I've come across throughout the day, or like an Instagram post that said something that I was like, it was witty in a way that I liked a lot, but I wanted to tweak it to make it work in my book. I would write those things down, and then I'd start from there, like saying, okay, where am I at my plot? What's the story? Can I incorporate one of these things into it? And then sometimes just as a writing exercise, I'll force myself to figure out a way to get that to fit in. And then that inspires other things. I use prompts a lot too, where I don't use AI to write anything that I write. However, I like to use AI to sanity check whether or not I'm going in a good direction. And the way I do that is if I know AI already has models of expectations in writing, I will write in, hey, this is going to happen in this story. What should I expect to have happen next? And then AI gives me its recommendations, and I do none of those. Because it's modeled off of other writing, and that's what's expected. And so that speeds up my normal process where I'll write something and be like, are they expecting that? James Patterson says, if you write 3 potential answers and use the third one because people have already thought of the other 2. Well, now we have GPT to say, what are those other 3 things? And then you just ask it for it. It gives them to you and you go, great, moving on, not using those. Sometimes I don't have those problems, but being open to using tools to do things. Some authors are just purists and they're like, I don't want to touch any of that stuff. I think you're losing the resource. You talk to people to give their opinion. Using AI to ask for its opinion on something there's nothing wrong with that, as long as as a writing purist, as long as it's not doing the writing for you.
Yeah.
And so you're just bouncing ideas off of somebody. It's just another somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. How do you know when you're forcing yourself to write because it should be part of your routine, and maybe forcing is the wrong word, versus you need to write?
That's one of those things, it's kind of like when, how do you know you're supposed to go to the gym to lift weights when you don't want to be in the gym? You got to do it. Right? And sometimes just the forcing function. Sometimes I'll just, there are lots of times that I don't feel like writing because I'm not feeling the inspiration, or I'm not excited about what's coming out. Or sometimes my hands hurt. There's all kinds of random things, so for me, there's a mixture of, there's a difference between, the difference between discipline and habit is discipline is you doing it even when it's hard, right? It's keeping to those things. I have a hard time with writing because it is a creative outlet, and then forcing myself on timelines with a creative outlet is almost counterintuitive. And so some people, if you're a writer, you're trying to meet a deadline and you got to work through it. It's a matter of setting aside time and saying, I'm going to set aside these 4 hours to do this writing, and then just write. Sometimes instead of writing, I'll just go back and I'll reread other chapters and just slowly edit those. However, that becomes the default then, where you've just reread your first 10 chapters like 14 times and you haven't read anything new. You feel stuck. So once again, that becomes a crutch. So it's a balance between feeling inspired, feeling in the note, but finding ways to prompt yourself to do new things. Sometimes just as an exercise, I'll have a chapter and I'll say, what if I wrote this? I like to write chapters from the perspective of the person most vulnerable in that chapter. And so that person usually has the best perspective of what's happening in that scene. But I also find that I can't do that all the time, because then you're confusing who the main character of the book is. Who's the main character? If my main character is my main character, I got to follow them more than other people, and I got to balance that out. So if I've written it from somebody else's perspective, just as an exercise, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to write it from someone else's and just see what happens. Mm-hmm. Or I'm going to follow them leading up to this moment and see if that gives me something different. And a lot of times I'll find that I've discovered a different avenue, a vehicle in the story that I want to execute.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were talking about the check boxes, and you're like, am I spending enough time with my kids? Am I doing enough of this? Am I dedicated enough to work and all this research? And I think when you say you're trying to balance that with writing, that's what stuck in my head, because I always struggle with that when I sit down to write. It's like, should I be writing right now, or should I be spending more time with my son, or should I be doing this or doing that? But if you always have those excuses, you never end up writing.
Committing yourself to a certain period of time every day. And that's the other thing about having a schedule, is if you say, I'm going to do it during this period of time, and everyone else has agreed that that's an okay time for me to do it, then you've worked through that. That's why a lot of my friends that write, they wake up really early in the morning to write.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I just can't. I travel a lot, and so what makes it nice is I write when I travel.
Okay.
I don't feel guilty about writing when I'm on the plane, because I'm just on the plane.
Yeah.
Or in my hotel room. And so that makes it easier.
Okay. That makes sense. What advice would you give someone who just published their first or second book?
Your first book. So every author's first book is their baby. And they're proud of it, and they're scared of it being let it go into the world, and they want all these magical things to happen for it. And they're going to learn that reality is a different thing. They're going to check their reviews on an hourly basis to see if another one came in. They're going to be sad when they don't arrive, or they'll get some random momentum and then suddenly it'll stop and they don't know what they did, and then they'll be chasing after all of these marketing options, and then they're going to be inundated in their email from random people that aren't real, from Gmail accounts that don't exist. So the writing world, stepping into it, is you're opening yourself up to an entirely different market and business situation. But you as an author don't think about those things when you're writing the story. So my recommendation is you recognize the fact that you've started another business. You want that business to succeed. You want to be effective at it. But remember why you initially did it. Did you do it because you wanted your books to sell so you could become an author? Or did you write the book because you felt the book needed to be written? Usually it's a combination of those things. You don't write a book because you don't want no one to read it. Nobody does that. However, also balancing that with why you want the reviews and why you want the sales. You want those because you want to feel successful at something that you love. And so, but you can love it with or without the success. And if you can find, you're going to find after the first book that when you've associated or rather disassociated your desire for success with your desire to write, and you can find a balance between those two things, you'll suddenly find that the reviews and those other things only matter really when you release the book at first. And then as you go in between books, you care less, and you find more peace with writing again. But that initial release of whatever book, indie published or traditional, is going to be a flurry of emotions. And some of that's going to be a mixture of imposter syndrome, a mixture of why not me. Very few of us become that 0.1% that becomes dramatically successful. Mm-hmm. And so in light of the fact that you most likely will feel this crippling failure of becoming an author, you're going to realize why you actually wrote the book to begin with, and that you will find an audience as long as you keep pushing. And so that is really, as a new author, you've got to realize, once returning back to why you write, and that has to be enough. It has to. Otherwise you won't.
Yeah. That is great advice. Thank you. Thank you for being so frank with that too. It is a very challenging process, and yeah, there's not a lot of that. It's 1% for a reason. So yeah,
it's soul crushing. And like, dang it, I forgot. It was another masterclass, but it was a great one about screenwriting. And it was like, there's 4 types of books. There's good books that sell. There's bad books that sell. There's good books that don't sell, and there's bad books that don't sell. There's only really 2 categories in there you want to be in. And the goal is just to figure out, just to get into those 2. Yeah. You know, I would not want to write a bad book that sells really well and be famous for being a terrible writer. I'm okay with having written good books that people haven't found yet.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Thank you. Where can listeners find your books?
So my book, audio-wise, is available pretty much everywhere. So whether it be Spotify or any major audiobook, Audible, anywhere like that. My narrator is Kirby Hayborn. I will be honest and say that Kirby is an incredible narrator. Is he the best narrator for a military techno thriller? I don't know. However, he was the narrator for Gone Girl, and he has done a bunch of other great books. He's an incredible actor, and he's a great narrator. And so I think he did a really good job. Is he like a Scott Brick or some of the other ones? No, but he also doesn't cost a stupid amount. So he was the perfect happy medium for me. A well-known name, a good voice actor, and he told the story well enough to where I was happy with what came out of it. And so you can find him. I wanted to make sure that you could find my book pretty much anywhere that audiobooks are sold.
Nice. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We are going to now dive into a couple extra questions, the spoiler full section. So if you do not want to know the answer to what happens at the end of the book, for listeners listening to this right now, you can pause the episode and come back after you have read the book. So that is your spoiler warning. So question, when you wrote the end, did you envision that it was going to happen that way in the end, how it was going to wrap up?
So yes and no. I had a picture of a ball of light and someone standing in a ball of light. Don't know why I was fixated on that, but I loved the idea of just this big old ball of light. And it was actually a real world thing my buddy and I were going to build. We started researching it, and we could get the thing that we call the white dwarf at the end of the story. Like, we did the math on that. That would work. So I wanted to have that scene. And so it was all about getting to that scene. Getting to a scene where there's this massive ball of light. And then I was like, well, how would that work? How would that make sense? How would they get there? And then I had to work backwards of what intel would lead them to that point. Why was the God algorithm relevant? And then I was like, well, how was Voodoo the linchpin? And then I was like, oh, well, Voodoo's going to discover how he's relevant to this story at the same time as he figures out what he needs to do. And those two things have to come in the fact that he has to confront his darkest fear. So that whole aspect of him reliving those moments in his dreams is actually a treatment part that ties back with post-traumatic stress, where people get stuck in a moment and they can't get past it, and they have to do things like take MDMA or some other type of psychedelic drug so that they don't have the emotional trauma associated with reliving an experience, so they can complete the experience, and so their brain is no longer trapped in a loop. Voodoo was trapped in a loop, and something had to break him through. And so the actual God algorithm, the very thing that was they were manipulating the entire time, was the thing that he needed to get through it. So he had to confront his problem head on, which is what he was doing the entire book. He's avoiding his problem. He's running away from it. And so now he has to run headlong into it. But he doesn't realize he's running straight into his past as he's doing the entire time. So I needed those things all happen and somehow get to a ball of light. So that's why I wrote it that way.
Okay.
But the part that surprised me was what happens with the villain after that scene. That was what I had not anticipated when I started writing it. That kind of just was a happy accident, because I was like, I've got to have some better reconciliation with this dude.
Okay. In the next book, I guess this is almost a forward-thinking question, but the girls that died as a result of him making that decision, when he knew, well, I guess he didn't really know what the impact was going to be when he killed the
Taro, the guy that he hit with the battery bomb. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he didn't know what the repercussions of that would be, but they were quite intense and sad, and that was a big emotional moment.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that is going to haunt him in the future?
That specific incident, no, but his past doesn't leave him. So he has, it just gets compounded with other things that he's got to deal with, So the sad part is when you've experienced, when you're not, that is like coupled with the kid in his memory is way worse than what happened with those girls. And Voodoo never saw the girls. He just knew what happened to him.
Yeah.
Right. So the kid is the one that has been constantly messing with his head because he doesn't forgive himself for doing that. And if you notice in the book, the only time Voodoo actually pulls the trigger on a gun is when he accidentally kills someone. Yeah. He never shoots a gun at any other time in the book because that's not his job. That's Frisco and Stu's job.
Yeah.
And so he uses other things to get his job done, but it's the reader will never pick up on the fact that Voodoo never actually shoots a gun.
No,
even though he's good at it, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever think about killing one of the main characters? I thought one of the main characters was going to die. I thought Stu was going to die or Fresco.
Yeah, you always do. But then you realize that if you're writing more books, it's kind of unforgivable, when you do that too early. I gotta make you really love them and then kill them.
Okay.
That's what George R.R. Martin does. He's like, oh, you love this person? Here, watch, I'm gonna kill all of them at once.
Yeah.
But it also got to make sure it fits the genre. Some genres that doesn't make sense. And this is kind of one of those genres where me killing all of the main, really good characters that you've created, it doesn't make sense in the first book. I can do it later. So readers, don't be surprised if that happens later. But
yeah,
when you get into the Spear and the Sentinel, so that one other things may happen in book 2, but that it's a debate for every. So it's kind of like killing dogs. You don't want to do it, it's really bad. So, but I wrote it in my first book, I put that in there because that was reality. When we went on target in Iraq, there were these wild dogs that would come at you. And we always had somebody with a silencer on their gun that would shoot them.
Wow.
It's horrible, but it's just if you're trying to, some of these people that we were going after were just horrible people. And if we were going to capture them, we had to sneak up on them. We couldn't have this early warning system of dogs everywhere barking and screaming at us. And these are some gross dogs. It's they didn't even look like dogs anymore. And I'm not happy about the fact that was one of the guys would do that, but I'm trying to paint a real picture. And so there's certain things I don't do in the book. And then there's some things I'm just like, I couldn't cut all of them out because then I'm writing a PG book about Navy SEALs, which is boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you get into gunfights like that, and in the end, which is why, I mean, anything goes, right? That's the whole point.
Right.
But you must try to avoid like a John Wick moment where it seems like everybody's shooting at your characters and nobody's hitting anybody, but they're all professional soldiers.
Right. There's a certain level of realism that doesn't make any sense if you have a John Wick moment. And I couldn't. Yeah, no, the characters are going to get messed up. Like that's what happens in war, especially. I mean, in my first book, they get particularly messed up in the beginning, because of especially in his dreams, because that's a memory. In that memory, they're getting super screwed up.
Yeah.
They all get screwed up, I think, kind of towards the end. But in my second book, I take it at a completely different angle. It's funny because a friend of mine was reading the second book, and they're like, "How did this part happen?" And they didn't get hurt, and then they finished the book, and they're like, "Oh, okay, I take everything back."
Okay.
I was like, "Yeah, at a certain point, they've got to get messed up. That's just reality." But also, you can't have them get messed up and then heal too quickly, and you got to figure out these plot points.
Yeah.
But you'd be amazed at how many firefights my friends have gotten in, and they didn't get a scratch on them because of how incompetent their enemy was.
Okay.
It's actually hard to shoot people. It's hard to shoot people. Yeah.
That's an interesting fact. You wouldn't know unless you were actually in it. Yeah.
No, there's some of my friends came back from stuff, and I was like, dude, you all should be dead. Every single one of you. I don't understand how that happened. And then there are other cases where simple stuff, like one case where a really close friend of mine got killed, and he was the only casualty in the entire combat, and everybody looks back, and they're like, we don't know how this happened. It was just...
Wow.
He got hit with a round from a distance that didn't make any sense, but it got him right in the head, and then that was it. So,
wow.
Anyway, so that's you want to tie some of that realism in there, at the same time not overwhelm the reader with too much.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Did you have to end this on a lighter note now? the dead hooker metaphor that you have to read the book to kind of understand where that comes from. Did you make that up, or is that something
that's a thing?
Okay. I assumed it was because it sounds very, very military brotherhood, but I had to ask.
No, that was always a joke. I'd bury a dead hooker for that guy.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to add that in there as like a dead hooker moment. And then I flip it on its head in the second book.
Okay.
Yeah, I use it again, but you're like, and then when you hear it the second time, you're like, ugh. I don't like that now. In the first part, it's like kind of just a crude way of explaining something, and the second time, you're like, that's messed up.
Yeah.
Not because the analogy is crude, but because of the way that it's being thrown back out.
Yeah.
You're like, dude, you're missing the spirit of that statement. Not that the spirit of that statement was any good to begin with, but yeah. Anyway.
Okay.
Which was my point. I wanted to throw it on its head for you to, as a reader, to come back and be like, have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you. It's good.
If you don't mind, if you can have a couple more minutes for the after show, when we wrap up here, and we'll get right into that for our Patreon members.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.